When you play the Game of Thrones,
Subscribe and like.
you die. There is no middle ground.
All right, hello YouTube. Welcome back to the Grease Goblins YouTube channel. Today's video, we're going to be talking about Arya Stark in the books versus the show. What things that they left out, especially in the first two books. Now, if you do end up liking this video, let me know. I may continue this kind of a series looking at the characters from the books and the differences from the show, but not sure if you guys are going to really enjoy this, given that this type of content that usually doesn't do all that well on the channel, but if you do want to see more of it, let me know so I can keep making these for you. But we're going to go through book 1 and book 2 and a lot of the differences from the book that greatly changed the character of the story in the books versus the show. And so I think this will become more apparent as we get into book 2, as book 2's arc is it's kind of like an outline is done in the show, but the details are very different. And it's something I've really noticed and picked up on as I've done my Clash of Kings reread. So without further ado, let's hop into Arya Stark. So Arya Stark starts out similar but different in the show versus the book. In the show, we're introduced to Arya right away. She's really in the opening scene after we get the whole stuff with the White Walkers at the beginning, the prologue of the story. And Arya Stark is seen kind of, yes, looking a bit lonely and a bit away from all the other women doing their needling, especially versus Sansa. And we see her, shoot an arrow because Bran is struggling. And so in the show, it instantly makes Arya feel like a tomboy. She's a little out of place. But that's not how we're introduced to Arya whatsoever in the books. In the books, it actually takes a while before we get an Arya POV. We don't actually get an Arya POV until after the royal party has already gotten to Winterfell, and we don't really interact with the character too much outside of her first chapter. And the major difference, even though the shots look very much the same, it starts with Arya doing her needlework with Sansa and Myrcella. And it's a different vibe here because instead of, Arya going to do this thing where she shoots a bow and all of that and kind of makes Bran look bad, it's actually her being bullied. She's being bullied by Septa Mordain in front of Myrcella, who is the princess at the time. She's of the royal family, and she's made to look really bad. And it's one of the reasons I point to Arya in the books being a much more, I think, interesting character, just based upon the way that she's treated by her family. Her getting bullied by Jane Poole and Sansa and Mordain, and even Myrcella to an extent. It's not really her bullying Arya, but you can tell that Myrcella feels a little bit embarrassed for Arya. And so right away, you kind of pick up the vibe that Arya is kind of isolated from some of her family and even, her quote unquote teacher in Mordain. And so that open to the character just strikes a very big difference. And another thing that was cut from the show, because basically Arya's first chapter is almost completely cut from the show in the first season, we get to see her and Jon's dynamic. We really don't get to see this in the show all that much, which isn't, I don't think, a huge problem because you can still feel, the chemistry of the actors and Maisie Williams and Kit Harington and in their last scene together of season 1 where Arya gets Needle. But it kind of is a bit more established in the book series. Arya goes and she actually meets up with Jon as they're watching some of the royal family being instructed how to sword fight and to joust and things like that. And we see this really big standoff between Joffrey and Robert. Really helps build the tension of the coming of the War of the Five Kings. But more importantly, we get some really interesting, parallels here. Arya is not allowed to fight and train because she's a girl, and Jon himself also can't because he's a bastard. So you see the parallels and the similarities between the two characters, and Arya is somebody that instantly is going to get a really good lesson from Jon, something that Jon kind of has been dealing with his whole life. Arya tells him that it isn't fair that she's going to get in trouble from her mother and all that stuff for her actions. And Jon says that nothing is fair. And that's how the first chapter kind of concludes for Arya. But it's a really interesting way to explore the character of Arya and how isolated she feels, kind of how alone she feels. And especially when she goes south and she doesn't have someone like Jon, anymore, it really paints this character who feels very isolated through a lot of the story. And that gets us kind of to her second chapter, which again, I think that the first season does a good job with Arya's character. I don't think they leave out too much. They do leave out some stuff that I think is an interesting decision. We'll talk about that when we get there, especially I think towards the back end of the first book. But I think for the most part, I think her introduction is solid in the show, but I think the books is just obviously stronger. We're able to be inside of her head. We get more expanded scenes with her. But like I said, the next time we meet up with Arya's character in the books anyway, from a POV, is in King's Landing. Now, the events of the Trident, for the most part, stay mostly the same. There isn't really a whole lot to talk about with Arya's character there. I think the show adapted that sequence pretty well. There is a difference here when we do get to her second chapter. So her second chapter, we see Sansa and Arya still having a lot of issues, both of them feeling different emotions towards Lady's death, which Sansa is kind of putting on to Arya, the same kind of idea that we see in the show, and this sets them to fighting. And we still see this scene where Ned is talking to Arya and how they must stick together and all of that stuff. But there's actually something that the show kind of omitted that is in the books. In the books, we actually see that Ned compares Arya to Lyanna quite a lot. And this is something unexpected for Arya because Arya is never described as being beautiful. Multiple characters mistake her as being a boy, but her aunt Lyanna was described as being beautiful. Rhaegar kidnapped her and, went away with her because of her beauty and all that stuff. And so it's really interesting the way that we paint that parallel with Arya. It's just something that's kind of missing from the show, but it instantly shows right away Ned's actions towards Arya and why he's maybe allowing her to train, allowing her to be herself because he has that love for his sister. And he doesn't want, Arya's fate to come to the same fate as Lyanna's. So he's trying to prepare her and kind of allow her to maybe choose her own life a little bit. This is something unheard of really for a Stark girl to be wielding a weapon and training how to be a water dancer and all this stuff. But I think it's the love of his sister that allows that. Something that's a bit missing from the show, but I still think it makes sense. But it is something that I wish we would have gotten to see in the show. But another really important lesson that we get from this conversation that is kind of cut from the show, it's still in the show, but it's not fully, right? Because Arya does, call Joffrey a liar and all that stuff, but we don't get this, in my opinion, one of the iconic lines of book one because it really paints Ned and his issues that he's dealing with, and that it really are going to pop up as the story moves on. As Arya says Joffrey is a liar, Ned says, well, sometimes we all have to lie. And it's interesting because you understand Ned's position. Ned is hiding something about the end of Robert's Rebellion, whether that's Ned and Ashara and that relationship, or whether that's, Lyanna's child or whatever happened at the Tower of Joy. Ned is lying about something. And he tells his daughter that sometimes you have to lie. Sometimes there are good lies. And that's even going to come up more in book one as we get to the point when, Robert dies. Ned does not tell Robert about his children on his deathbed or his lack of children with Cersei. And so I think those are some really impactful moments that I wish had been in the show, but just were kind of left out for, I'd probably say, pacing reasons. This moves us to chapter 3. There's really only one main difference with Arya in chapter 3. It's the sequence where she ends up seeing Illyrio and Varys talking and all that stuff, and she relays that then to Ned and all that stuff. The only major difference is really the start of the chapter, as Arya is, yes, chasing these cats, and she's trying to catch this one-eared black tomcat that Arya just has not been able to catch up to this point. And when she finally catches it, she actually runs into Tommen and Myrcella, who once again mistake her as being like a beggar or something like that, or an orphan. And Arya, being so embarrassed, actually has to run away from them using some of her skills, her survivability skills, and she actually knocks over Tommen running away. This is something, again, the show just kind of cut. They just had Arya, yes, is looking for the cat, but she just wanders her way, into the dungeons and all that stuff. So to me, I think that it still works in the show, of course, but I think that it is much more fleshed out here. You can understand how Arya gets lost because she's so worried about being discovered and the repercussions that'll have on her and how she'll maybe be punished by someone like Mordain. But yeah, again, there's not a huge amount of differences, just something I wanted to point out. As we then get to her fourth chapter, and again, we do see through Sansa's POV that Arya and Sansa still are having issues. Arya throws like this, I believe it's an orange in the books, at Sansa, and it kind of ruins her dress. That has a big rift between the two, and that causes what we'll eventually see when Ned has a sit down with Sansa and Arya, who Arya is willing to go back north as long as Syrio can come with her. She doesn't really particularly like the South all that much. She wants to be, I'd say, with her family and all that stuff, very differently than her sister Sansa, who really wants to stay here. And so when we get into the fourth chapter for her, which is directly after Ned's coup's failed attempt, we see her basically have what I would say is an Assassin's Creed kind of chapter, where Arya, again, it all starts pretty similar to what we see in the show, where she's training with Syrio. Syrio is kind of dismantling some of the guards, and then he has Arya run away. Same idea happens here, but the only difference is in the show, they kind of cut out the entire next part of the chapter, which is her escaping. She has basically this whole plot where she's trying to figure out what actually happened. Looking at the Tower of the Hand, all these men are being slaughtered. She runs into Holland, who's the master of their horses at this point, telling her to warn Ned and her father and all that stuff. And it's too late at this point, as we know. But we see an interesting moment that once again is cut out from the show that I think is really important to Arya's character because it shows her growing anger and frustration, the things that are going to drive her really in the next couple books and really until Winds of Winter. She kicks Desmond's body in frustration. This is one of the guards that Ned has. And we had earlier seen in her past chapter where Arya asks about her father's safety. And it is said that, oh, 10 men equal one southern man down here. And, well, Arya believes that's a lie. They failed to protect her father, and now he's in custody. And it just continues to get even more exciting because as we're going through this story, Arya is having to, walk through a courtyard full with gold cloaks, trying to walk with confidence that she's just some random child, nobody that they should be looking for or looking at. And she has to use all these lessons of being brave and moving silent and all this other stuff. It feels like very much Assassin's Creed, like a mission that Arya is going through. And so then she then escapes, kind of how she does in the show, where she uses these pathways that she discovered previously when she had seen Illyrio and Varys, and we get into her final chapter of the book. The only real major differences from her finale in the show and the books, the show cuts out a lot of Arya and what she's been doing between Ned's failed coup and Ned's execution. They kind of gloss through how Arya's been surviving. Like, it's still there in essence. You still get the vibe and it still works in the show. It's just much more expanded in the books, of course, right? Arya is basically starving almost. She's being basically almost robbed. She's being, robbed in the middle of the night. She's, having to try and kill, pigeons to try and get some sort of food. She's resorting to try and steal. And we get a lot of interesting themes with her character. Like, when is it right to ever steal? And that is present in the show, right? We do see her, trying to sell a pigeon, for instance, her killing one. But it's just a lot more. You get more of that. And so another big point where we see Arya's lessons from Syrio are already like coming out is when she's kind of investigating all the docks and the gates to try and figure out some way of escape, we see her actually foil a Lannister plan where they had dressed up some guards to look like Stark men to, pretend that they were going to take Arya away. And Arya figures this out. So again, there's just a lot more context into Arya growing as a character and her, in between chapters 4 and 5 for her in book 1. And then the only other real difference here is that instead of in the show where the show basically starts with like the prelude or the opening half of A Clash of Kings where Arya is recounting how they get out of King's Landing, the show just ends with they're out of King's Landing and they're going to be on the road for season 2, which I actually really like. I think that's an improvement by the show. In the book, it's kind of left on a major cliffhanger. Arya is being taken away by Yoren after the execution of her father, and she's being basically held against a wall while Yoren has a knife, close to her. And we're kind of left here thinking, is Yoren going to kill her? What is he doing? Now, obviously, Yoren's not going to kill her, but kind of leaves it on a very ambiguous note, right? But that is her for book 1. So then we head into book 2. Now, book 2 has like 2 major arcs. It has the pre-Harrenhal arc and the Harrenhal arc. Now, here's what I want to say right away. Season 2, in a lot of ways, I think improves on some stuff with Arya's journey, but it also doesn't in other ways, and we'll talk about it as they get there, but they combine a lot of her story. Whereas Arya in the book, in my opinion, is a very dominant POV. She's one of the major POVs of the story, especially in A Clash of Kings. In season 2, she's not really that major of a character as much as she is in the book, where in the show, they combine a lot of her scenes. They kind of take some scenes that weren't in the book, or they take some scenes that maybe happen later on and they'll push them forward, or sometimes some things that happen a bit earlier in the book happens later. Arya's season 2 journey to me is always interesting because it is really, I think, the first major arc that starts to differentiate from the book. And I think even the meaning of her arc actually changes from book 2 to the show. So let's kind of dive in as we get into Arya and A Clash of Kings. So right away, again, we kind of skip forward in the show. In the show, we're already journeying, and we don't have to worry about how she gets out of King's Landing, all that stuff. Whereas in the book, we're much different. The book, we kind of start with a slow burn. We recount what actually happened at King's Landing. But in my opinion, I think the biggest shame of season 2 with Arya's journey is we don't really get to see the suffering of the small folk. We don't see what this war is doing to the world, right? We're not really going to see that until the story starts to expand a bit more, or we're going to see it through other plot lines. Whereas in the book, Arya is really our point of view into how the small folk, especially the Riverlands, are doing during this time. Because there isn't much time given to Arya's pre-Harrenhal arc in the show. In the show, we get a couple scenes of them kind of traveling, and then they get to this inn, and Yoren tells Arya the story of trying to cope with her father's death and all that stuff. And that's where in the show her actual little ritual at night where she recounts the names actually comes from. And then right after that, they're instantly captured by the mountain. So that all happens really quickly. And all of that happens really quickly. Whereas in the book, that is a span of 5 chapters. In the book, we get this really slow burn of each and every chapter building on as the horror is growing worse and worse. They're hearing screams in the middle of the night. Holdfasts are being burned. They can see all of this. They're walking into the danger. And so the main difference is the story in the book takes more time to build up the horrors of war, the main theme of the entire story, and then also building Arya's growing fear. She's growing more and more fearful. And so there's a lot more of that development there where it lets things breathe a bit more, in my opinion, in the book versus how the show does it. So there's just a lot of differences here. So they end up making it to this keep, and they're trying to figure out how to cross, the lake. They're trying to get north, and they're kind of in a really tough spot because the road is getting more treacherous, and so they think maybe they can try and get a boat and try to, get across, right? Get across the lake or the God's Eye. And so at this point, during that night, we're at the inn. They're attacked by Amory Lorch, and this is where all of the men really die. That's with Arya's, company. She and a couple others escape. We see her, release the prisoners like she does in the show. But again, all this stuff just happens very differently. We even get a chapter right after this where Arya is on the road and they're trying to find their way. And again, it's a lot of foreshadowing to what we're going to see in A Storm of Swords, but it's them starving and just realizing what other people have now been put through, where they don't have food and all this stuff. Why so many people were fleeing south to begin with. And so it just builds Arya's fear. It's a deconstruction of the character we came to know in book 1, whereas Arya in a lot of ways was growing as being this fearless tomboy, assassin type character. Book 2 is about deconstructing that, showing her, the real world, the horrors of the war and things like that, and taking away any, glamorization of war and putting it right in our faces. And that's really going to come to the front when we get to the point where we get to her, her Harrenhal arc. That's where it really starts to settle in. And so as we get to her 6th chapter, which is a transitional chapter, it's, her now in captivity, because that's another part of it that is not in the show either. Again, a lot of Arya's journey is cut in this season. Arya and co, they have to try and sneak into this village because they need food. They're desperate. Gendry gets captured, and then eventually Arya gets captured, and everybody else gets captured. They're now in the mountain's custody, like what happened in the show. But once again, we get one of the darkest chapters in A Song of Ice and Fire with Arya 6, A Clash of Kings, which is just her seeing fear. It is just her seeing atrocities. People being tortured right in front of her, like we do see in the show, but that happens at Harrenhal, whereas here, it actually happens at this, village that they're at and where they're being kept in a pen. Again, it's all similar to what we see in the show, but just it happens differently. And that's where we're kind of at with the books at this point with Arya's journey. And there's just been a lot of stuff that they've kind of completely cut out. Also, I think what the section Arya 5 does that's great for Arya is, again, it kind of builds on how she's learning to be stealthy, how she would be a good assassin and using her survival skills. But in Arya 6, it's her watching as people are tortured in front of her for, any type of answers, and then instantly they're killed anyway, so it doesn't matter. It's her watching as people are killed brutally for the littlest of things, talking out of turn, saying something that the men disagree with, watching, women being sexually abused, harassed, assaulted, and even watching one woman who tries to defend herself from sexual assault is killed brutally in front of them. And this all kind of gets us to Harrenhal, where Arya feels defeated. She hates herself. She hates the villagers. She hates because she has no control over her life anymore. Even her secret identity is gone of being a girl, right? Because she's been hiding that this whole time. It's the deconstruction of Arya where she's now more of a meek character. She can't do anything. Even if she had Needle, with her, if that after that had been taken, it wouldn't have mattered, right? And so that's the whole story with Arya in this book. And as we get into Harrenhal and she gets there and she's put under this character of Wheeze, who is supposed to basically take any of that fight that's left in her. Arya has a little bit. She speaks up about wanting to be put, helping the horses in her role at Harrenhal. It's them going, no, we want to dehumanize you, take away any type of thought process that doesn't align with ours in the books, right? That's what happens at Harrenhal. And the Lannisters, of course, still have Harrenhal, so it's not any different than the show up to this point. But this is where I think a lot of the Harrenhal story starts to change. Now, I'm not going to get into every single detail that's different because there's just a lot of details that are very different, but I'm going to kind of sum it up. When you think about the way the arc goes with the show, in the show, Arya is a hostage, of course. She's watching these tortures happen. And then Tywin shows up, and Tywin has Arya become, his cupbearer. That does not happen in the show. Tywin never meets Arya. Arya briefly sees him, and when the army is, leaving Harrenhal. But again, that doesn't really happen in the show the way it does in the book. Whereas Arya, yes, she gets her 3 names. She uses it completely differently than how she does in the show. And whereas I like Tywin and Arya scenes, it's just not something that happens in the book. So in the book, it's much different. Arya spends a decent amount of time serving under Whis, where she's delivering messages, doing just other type of servant stuff, where it's like filling, bath water, bringing water from place to place, maybe even serving, meals or wine or stuff like that at dinners or feasts. And so that is where she is at this point. She has lost all sense of agency because of what is going on at Harrenhal at this point. And so Jaqen approaches her with the names. This is kind of seen for Arya to have some control of her life back. And eventually she does start using them. Now, all of these names are used completely differently. She actually says Chiswick. Now, this is because Chiswick is sexually assaulting another woman, and so Arya doesn't like this, and she has him killed. She doesn't really think about what these names could mean, and she also probably doesn't even believe that Jaqen's even going to kill them. Well, Chiswick ends up dead, and her next one, which is Wheeze, because Wheeze is kind of this abusive master. He can apparently smell disobedience and stuff like this. Well, Arya wants Wheeze dead as well, and so Wheeze also ends up dying. Now, Arya, similar to the way in the show she was going to try and name Tywin or something like that because she regrets, not taking out the more important people, well, she can't find Jaqen. And so that leads to her 3rd name. So in season 2, this happens very late, and what ends up happening in season 2 is Arya uses Jaqen's name to escape Harrenhal. That doesn't happen here, and this is kind of where things are very much sped up. Where in the book, we're kind of around like the 2/3 section of the book. Arya does name Jaqen himself so that she can use him, but she uses it for a different reason, because after Tywin leaves, Amory Lorch is then set to be the person ruling after he leaves. Now, this is quite a big change, because at this point, what we end up seeing is the brave companions come back with a bunch of northern captives, about 100 to be precise. And so that's another thing. Vargo Hoat is completely cut out of the story. He was kind of replaced in the show, and I just, I don't mind it because Vargo Hoat to me is a really weird character based on how he speaks and stuff like that. So I can really understand why they cut him out for, I would say, realism and stuff like that. But I do think it's an interesting change to say the least. And so what Arya does is she sees her opportunity. If she can set these Northmen free, they can retake the castle from the Lannisters. But here's the thing, she doesn't realize that was already the plan, regardless of herself doing it. So Jaqen at this point, he then helps her with this whole soup situation. And by the way, also Arya is going as Weasel at this point as well. She's having to use different aliases, different names. And so she uses this soup or this stew and uses it on the guards to free the northern men that were in prison. Now, what Arya doesn't realize is this was already the plan. The brave companions had flipped over to the Stark side, or more like to Roos's side, as he had bribed them, and he ends up taking Harrenhal from the Lannisters. Amory Lorch is brutally killed, which you can't feel that bad for him because he killed Yoren. Arya sees Amory Lorcha stripped naked and is basically killed by a bear. It's the same bear we're going to see with the Brienne arc as well. Now, I will say something else that I kind of missed earlier on. I wanted to point out, Arya at this point, the only thing that's keeping her going is her anger and her hate towards the people that have done all these wrongs to her. So in the show, we get this whole, talk with Yoren, and that's what kind of sparks Arya to make this list of names. In the book, it is very different. Arya in Arya 6 is kind of where she starts to repeat these names because it's the only thing that keeps her going. It's the only, disobedience that she can really do at this. And so at this point, we have a switch in rulership. At one point, at the start of Harrenhal's arc, we had the Lannisters. Now we have the Boltons with the Stark banner up. And we very quickly find out that Roose Bolton is maybe not the most trusting, as a lot, and I mean a lot, foreshadowing for the Red Wedding happens here. Just the way Arya now becomes the cupbearer of Roose, very differently in the show where it was to Tywin. I think Tywin and Arya's stuff is way better than Roose and Arya's stuff, but still, that's what we get, and I do think it makes sense given the context of the story. Now, Arya, of course, is not recognized by Roose. It doesn't really surprise me. Arya looks vastly different at this point. Her hair has been shaved all the way down. It's shaved once again when she gets to Harrenhal. She does not look anything like she would have looked like in book 1. But what she does listen into is a lot of the counsel between Roose Bolton and the Freys. And we even see her, which I think is really interesting, is she actually meets the person that she was betrothed to. Because when Robb Stark breaks his contract with the Freys when he marries Jane Westerling, we actually see the Frey that was supposed to marry Arya Stark. It's a really interesting little nod there that you might actually miss on your first read that I think is really cool. But Arya at this point, and also I should mention, her and Jaqen, split ways after kind of Weasel Stew situation, right? That's her third name. She unnames Jaqen. And so Arya at this point has no names left. She's just being a cupbearer to Roose Bolton, but she has kind of gotten some of her agency back. She becomes a cupbearer because of her actions and her quote unquote basically loyalty. And one of the things that Arya also sees here is a lot of the servants, the people that were being forced to serve here, are being killed. And you sit there and you go, wait, these people who are forced to be servants are being killed by Roose Bolton to send a message. It just tells you all you need to know if you're Arya in this situation, that yes, we may have switched sides, but okay, this isn't any better, right? Roose Bolton is not somebody that Arya trusts revealing herself to, even though she probably originally had planned to do so when breaking out the Northern Men. She realizes this is not somebody that she can really do that for. And so again, we see Arya learning a bunch of different information, the descent in the Northern, plot line. Not going to go into it because it doesn't really impact Arya all that much, in my opinion. But what is important is that Roose Bolton ends up going on this hunting trip to get some wolf skins. It's very on the nose that Roose is going to betray the Starks, which to me, I still beat myself up after not expecting that. There's just so much, especially when you reread the books, there's just so much on the nose foreshadowing. It makes you feel so stupid. But she does find out that Roose's plans are, eventually he's going to head out from Harrenhal. This is going to be because of the wedding. We know that Roose has the whole Duskendale plot get put in motion to kind of, again, weaken the northern forces and preserving his own. But he's going to leave the castle to Vargo Hoat. This is somebody that Arya knows does not want to be in contact with. She knows enough about Harrenhal as she's been learning, the people there. This is not a good sign. And so Arya needs to regain all of her strength, her courage, and control of her life and try to escape Harrenhal. She enlists Gendry in this, Hot Pie in this, trying to get them food and weapons. And she herself breaks out of Harrenhal, taking back control. It's this full arc, right, where Arya starts with a breakdown of her character to build back up into the person she's going to be, and foreshadowing and hinting at the future assassin she will be. In the show, they took that away from the character. What is Arya's real character arc in season 2? And that's the one thing that, even though I love a lot of the scenes in season 2 with Arya, when you look at it from an overall narrative point of view, Arya doesn't really change that much, or the end of season 1 to the end of season 2. There's not much that really changes there. Whereas in the book, there's a drastic difference with the character of Arya. Here, in the show, there isn't really that much there. Even though I think it's great entertainment, it's great television. I love season 2. Compared to the books, there's just no competition. George R. R. Martin knew how to write this character better than D&D did, and that's something that's going to pop up, I think, consistently, especially as we get to the later books. But at this point, Arya, does this great plan where she goes up to this guard and does a really stealthy kill on him, saying, "Oh yeah, everybody's getting some coin for that's on watch duty or whatnot." Because there's only one guard that they can see at the gate that they're trying to go out of, and she drops it, making him come down to her length so that she can stab him in the neck. Really awesome scene. It's got some really fantastic art for this moment that I'll probably have up on screen. I've used it in a couple of videos. Fantastic job by the artist. And so that is kind of where we end with the Clash of Kings, with her and Co escaping. But if you guys couldn't tell, I think Arya is a good character in the show. Don't get me wrong. But I think in the books, she's just significantly better. Her arc from really book 1 to book 2 is fulfilled really nicely. And so again, at the end of this video, if you guys want to see more of this content, and I do plan, if you guys like this, if this does well on YouTube, I will go through a lot of the other characters, but especially for the main ones where there's a lot to talk about with all of the series, with throughout the entire series, these will probably be brought up into part 1, part 2 idea. But yeah, I hope you guys all, enjoyed. If there's a moment that you think I missed out on, I didn't talk specifically on every single missing detail, but I kind of gave the more, I think, important or missing elements that the show missed on that the books had. But I'll see you guys all in the next one. Bye, guys.